총수익 투자 방식이라는
자본 차익과 이자 배당 수익까지를 다 해서 이제 내가
네.
노후자금 인출 설계를 하겠다는 건데 수익률 어떤 순서를 만지하느냐가 은퇴자금의 소진 속도에 커다란 영향을 미친다.
A more globally diversified stock portfolio alongside probably more of a Korean bond portfolio.
다음 질문 바로 한번 들어가 보도록 하겠습니다. 네, 한국도 이제 저금리로 인해서 저희가 계속 이야기했던 평생 지급을 보장하는 종신연금 상품이 점차 줄어드는 추세인데요. 이런 맥락에서 볼 때 한국도 미국처럼 은퇴자들이 은퇴소득 마련을 위해서 투자에 조금 더 이렇게 의존하는 방향으로 나아갈 건지가 궁금합니다. 파워 박사의 이야기 한번 들어보겠습니다.
Yeah, that's been a challenge now. In the last few years, interest rates have come up some, I know at least in the United States. And so that is making it easier to use fixed income products, whether we're talking about bonds or annuities. It is becoming a little easier. There was a period where interest rates got extremely low and the level of sustainable spending possible became extremely low. But still, indeed, people are living longer. And I know in Korea that has some of the highest longevity in the world. And so that does, the longer people live, the less income can be supported really from anything, but from annuities or other fixed income products. And so people might increasingly view there's a need to take risk in the markets and to build that total return investing strategy to have the type of growth needed to sustain retirement spending over a potentially long horizon of if people are retiring in their 60s, they may be looking at 30 or even 40 years in retirement, and they really need growth as a part of that. Alongside, I mean, there can be a role for the fixed income and for the annuities, but really it becomes an issue of needing aspects of both. And in that regard, at least, I do think we'll see the continued interest and development of total return investing approaches as part of that process.
저희가 그 이야기 중에 총수익 투자 방식이라는 표현을 썼는데 이게 책에도 등장하긴 하지만 조금 말이 어렵잖아요. 그런 만큼 한번 설명을 좀 부탁드립니다. 이게 배당이나 이자로만 이렇게 생활하고 원금은 건들지 않겠다. 이런 걸 목표로 하는 한국 은퇴자분들 입장에서는 조금 낯선 개념일 수도 있을 것 같아서요.
보통 이제 은퇴 생활하시는 분들이 이자 받아서 생활한다, 뭐
네.
배당 받아서 생활한다. 그러니까 내가 원본은 그대로 두고 늘어난 수익에 대해서만 인출을 해서 이제 노후 생활을 하겠다는 컨셉이 있는데
네.
이렇게 인컴, 늘어난 수익, 인컴만 가지고 생활한다는 개념이 아니고 총 투자 수익이란 말은 토탈 리턴이라는 개념이죠. 자본 차익과 이자 배당 수익까지를 다 해서 이제 내가 노후자금 인출 설계를 하겠다는 건데 이걸 조금 더 확장시켜 나가보면 내가 가지고 있는 투자 원금까지도 다 동원을 해서 내 생애 동안 그 자금들을 다 인출해서 쓰면서 내가 죽기 전에 이 돈이 다 안 떨어지면 되는 거잖아요.
네.
그걸 이제 투자하면서 원본과 자본 차익과 이자 배당까지 다 합쳐가지고 그걸 가지고 내가 노후 설계를 하는 거, 그 관점을 좀 넓은 범위에서 이제 총 투자 수익 방법이라고 의미하는 것 같습니다.
알겠습니다. 이번엔 은퇴자들에게 적합한 자산 배분에 대한 질문 한번 드려보았습니다.
Yep. So a lot of the basic research about retirement planning in the US tends to focus on just a simple asset allocation where the stocks are represented by the S&P 500, which is the large cap US stock index. And then bonds are represented by intermediate term government bonds. So bonds that have around a 5-year maturity. And just allocating between those provides a simple asset allocation framework, really more for research purposes because it's based on historical data and you need long periods of historical data to really be able to assess this. So some of the other asset classes, there's just not sufficient data available. That's probably also why there's less research on international diversification. And with the US stock market capitalization being so large, it's important for people in the US to globally diversify, but maybe not as important as it is in other countries. So if I were to just talk about how you might extend that research to a country like Korea, probably instead, it's not the S&P 500, it's not the same US stock index that you'd be thinking about. but something that is more of a globally diversified portfolio of stocks. In that research in the US, it says generally hold anywhere from, say, 40 to 80% stocks. Initially, it was 50% or higher, but that has expanded some to in the ballpark of 40 to 80% stocks can be a pretty comfortable range. And then also on the bond side, you do have to think about inflation being important for retirees. And so you want to have bonds that will link to your country's inflation. So that could speak in some cases against more globally diversified bonds. But there could be a role for international bonds alongside Korean bonds that should link better to the inflation experience in Korea. And also, well, probably allocating more to the Korean stock market than its capitalization weight in the global portfolio, but not excessively in the Korean stock market. A more globally diversified stock portfolio alongside probably more of a Korean bond portfolio, but with some international diversification as well.
이렇게 파우 박사가 한국 주식시장, 글로벌에 분산한 주식 포트폴리오, 그리고 한국 채권 등에 이렇게 적절히 배분하라는 조언을 주었는데, 이 자산 배분이라는 게 경험이 많지 않으면 당장 쉽지 않은 것도 보면 사실이어서요. 어떻게 생각하세요?
솔직히 뭐 일반 개인들 그리고 뭐 퇴직연금 투자하시는 분들이 모두가 투자 전문가는 아니고
맞아요.
대다수가 직장인들이라서 자산 배분을 뭐 말은 쉽죠. 이렇게 나누라. 주식 채권 나누고 종목 나누고 하라 그러는데 개인이 그걸 하기가 상당히 어렵습니다.
않을 수 있죠. 네.
그리고 또 해놓은 다음에 또 리밸런싱 한다고 또 정기적으로 하고 이거를 일일이 할 수 있는 투자자, 특히나 퇴직연금이나 개인연금 가입자가 많지 않기 때문에 그런 분들 입장에서는 타겟 데이트 펀드 같은 것들이 대안이 될 수는 있을 것 같아요. 그러니까 글로벌하게 주식 채권에 자산 배분을 하고 있고요.
네.
그리고 은퇴까지 기간이 많이 남았을 때는 주식 전체 비중을 좀 높게 가져가다가 은퇴 시점에 맞춰서 주식 비중을 알아서 또 조정해주는 역할들을 하니까
네.
전반적으로 글로벌 자산 배분도 하고 생애 주기에 따른 자산 배분도 알아서 해주는 거라서 혹시 초보 은퇴 투자자라고 하면 아니면 초보 투자자가 아니라고 하더라도 이제 노후 준비를 할 때 내가 하기 어려운 시간적인 제약들이
맞아요.
있는 분이라고
네.
하면 타겟 데이트 펀드나 이런 펀드들을 한번 활용해 보시는 것도 좋은 방법, 대안이 될 수 있을 것 같습니다.
네, 저도 개인적으로 연금 투자는 TDF를 많이 활용을 하고 있는데 제 주변 분들도 직장인들이 아무래도 많다 보니까 TDF에 연금 자산을 많이 맡기고들 계시는 것 같습니다. 그래서 이 TDF에 대해서는 또 파우 박사가 어떻게 생각하는지 한번 의견 물어보았습니다.
Right. Yeah, target date funds are a very interesting idea. It can be helpful for people who don't have a lot of experience with investing and so don't really know how to design their portfolio. It's a simple fund you choose when the target date is your retirement. And the idea is the further you are from the target date, the more aggressively you can invest. So that maybe when you're 30 or 40 years from the target date, it might even be 80 or 90% stocks. But then as you get closer to the target date, you lower the stock allocation and increase the bond allocation to help reduce volatility around those investments, to help you guide you into retirement. And so those target date funds in the US, they can get too conservative at the target date. We talked earlier about how generally you want at least 40%, but even 50% stocks or more in retirement. And a lot of target date funds in the United States can get down to 20 or 30% stocks at the retirement. So I do worry about that idea, but just the general idea for people who don't really know how to build an investment portfolio, a simple target date fund that has them invest more aggressively when they're young and takes away some of that risk as they get closer to retirement. I think that can be a very powerful approach. And might help people to invest in a more diversified portfolio. Whereas if they just were choosing things on their own, they might put too much of the money in short-term bonds that really just don't provide enough growth opportunity.
네, 스스로 포트폴리오를 짜고 관리하기 어려운 경우에는 TDF도 답이 될 수 있다. 이런 의견을 주셨고요. 이번엔 노후자금 인출을 할 때 주의해야 할 점, 조심해야 할 것들에 대한 이야기를 한번 해보려고 하는데요. 수익률 순서라는 개념이 있습니다. 이 개념에 대해 한번 이야기를 해보고 이게 왜 중요한지 그리고 어떻게 하면 대비 혹은 준비할 수 있을지에 대한 이야기 한번 나눠보도록 하겠습니다.
Yeah, so this is the idea of sequence of returns risk, and it's one of the biggest differences in retirement compared to pre-retirement. It's the idea that you may retire at a time where on average markets do well, and if you have a 30-year or 40-year retirement, the average market return might be pretty good over your retirement. But it's not just the average; it's also the order of those returns. And when you're saving every year, if you're working and saving a percentage of your salary, you actually can benefit from a market downturn while you're saving, because it means you get to buy more shares at a discount. Your savings for that year, buy more shares, and then by the time you retire, if markets recovery, you've got more assets than you would have otherwise had. And so no one likes seeing market downturns, but it doesn't necessarily hurt you pre-retirement. That all changes post-retirement. If you're retired and you have to meet certain fixed expenses, so you have to sell from your investment portfolio to fund those expenses, if there's a market downturn, you have to sell a bigger percentage of what's left or a bigger share of your remaining assets to meet those expenses. And then that starts to dig a hole where even if the market recovers, your portfolio doesn't get the full opportunity to recover along with the market because you're spending from the portfolio. And so that can really lead to an outcome where the first 5 to 10 years of retirement, the market returns during that time really matter a lot to the long-term success of that retirement. And if markets go down in early retirement and then go up later and maybe do great later in retirement, even though the average return could be pretty good, it may really be the case that retirees suffer and don't get to enjoy as high of standard of living because they just didn't have the assets left to benefit from the later market recovery. They had to spend more and more of what's left in those early retirement years to deal with that market downturn. Well, so there's a number of different possibilities for that. The less fun version of it, but that's where things like the 4% rule come into play, is just try to spend less. The less you're spending, the less danger there is that you get into that downward spiral where a market downturn makes it hard to ever recover. But that's not the most fun way to approach retirement. So the other options that are out there, there's a whole world of variable spending strategies where if you can adjust your spending. If markets are doing well, you might spend even more. But if there's a market downturn, if you can cut your expenses temporarily during the market downturn, that can help a lot to manage that sequence of returns risk. So just being flexible and willing to temporarily reduce your spending can help a lot. And then with other approaches, we talked about the idea that if you can start preparing for retirement 5 or 10 years before you get there, that can help lay the foundation to manage this sequence of returns risk. I could start purchasing individual bonds in the years leading up to retirement so that they're maturing and I get that face value so I know exactly what I'm entitled to spend in those years and I'm not subject to the market losses. The sequence of returns risk, it only happens if you have to sell assets at a loss. So if you have bonds to cover your spending for the next several years or in those early retirement years, that can be a powerful way to manage sequence of returns risk. And then also annuities can be a powerful tool to provide those lifetime income protections so that, again, you're not exposed to having to sell during a market downturn to meet expenses because you have that reliable lifetime income. And then there can be buffer assets. I don't know how prevalent these will be in Korea, but in the US, things like a reverse mortgage or permanent life insurance. Really, if you have an asset that, well, fixed, we talked, a principal protected fixed income product might actually play this role where you don't really think of it as part of your investment portfolio. It's more like a buffer or a reserve in the background that you can draw from temporarily during market downturns to meet your expenses so that you don't have to sell your assets at a loss, so that you give your portfolio an opportunity to recover. That can be a really powerful way as well to just get your portfolio back on track while still meeting your expenses So it's to review the flexible spending, if you can temporarily reduce your spending, or just getting to retirement with bonds covering or annuities covering expenses over the next few years so that you don't have to sell if there's a market downturn, or just having something else outside of your portfolio that can be a temporary spending resource to meet expenses so that, again, you don't have to sell from your portfolio.
저희가 이렇게 수익률 순서 위험에 대비하거나 대처하는 방법에 대한 이야기 한번 나누어 보았는데, 이전에 번역했던 책에서 요 수익률 순서 위험을 파라오와 요셉의 비유로 한번 들었던 기억이 납니다. 한 번 더 쉽게 설명을 부탁드릴게요.
이제 수익률의 크기가 중요하죠.
네.
그런데 이제 똑같은 수익률이라도 내가 어떤 수익률, 좋은 수익률을 먼저 받느냐, 나쁜 수익률을 먼저 받느냐에 따라서 은퇴자금의 소진 시기가 달라진다. 특히나 이제 은퇴 초기에 안 좋은 수익률을 맞게 되면 자금이 줄어든 상태에서 생활비까지 꺼내 쓰게 되면
네.
소진 속도가 훨씬 빨라질 수밖에 없잖아요. 그래서 우리가 어떤 수익률 순서를 만드냐가 어떻게 보면 평균 수익률, 기간의 평균 수익률은 동일하더라고 하더라도 순서에 따라서 자금 고갈 시기가 달라질 수 있다는 게 수익률 순서 위험인데, 네. 아까 말씀하셨던 또 파라오와 요셉 이야기는 성경책에 네. 나오는 이야기입니다. 저도 기독교 신자는 아니라서 네. 성경의 자세한 내용은 모르지만 비유를 한번 들어볼게요. 네. 파라오가 꿈을 꿉니다. 꿈에 살찐 황소 7마리랑 여인 황소 7마리가 나옵니다. 네. 하도 요상한 꿈이라서 요셉을 불러서 물어봅니다. 이게 무슨 꿈이냐? 라고 물어봤더니 요셉이 뭐라고 하냐면, 이 나라에 7년 연속 풍년이 들고 이어서 7년 연속 흉년이 들 거라는 거예요. 그런데 한번 우리가 생각을 해볼게요. 만약에 올리브씨 같으면 네. 풍년이 먼저 7년이 오고 흉년이 7년이 오는 게 좋겠어요? 아니면 흉년이 먼저 7년이 오고 풍년이 7년이 이어서 오는 게 낫겠어요?
저는 그래도 풍년이 먼저 오면 좋겠습니다.
그렇죠. 풍년이
네.
먼저 오면 남는 잉여 자산을 축적을 해놨다가 나중에 흉년에 쓸 수 있죠. 근데 네. 만약에 흉년이 먼저 와버리면 네. 풍년이 오기도 전에 고갈나 버릴 수 있습니다.
그러네요. 네.
그래서 이제 흉년 7년, 흉년 7년 똑같은 거잖아요. 네. 그런데 이 순서에 따라서 결과가 완전히 달라질 수 있다. 그래서 시퀀스가 되게 중요하다는 의미에서 이제 수익률 순서 리스크를 이야기하고, 네. 은퇴 초기 10년간의 수익률 관리를 어떻게 하느냐, 그 수익률 어떤 순서를 만지하느냐가 은퇴자금의 소진 속도에 커다란 영향을 미친다. 매우 중요한 요소라는 이야기에서 이제 은퇴 인출하면 맨날 나오는 이야기가 이 수익률 순서 리스크에 대한 이야기들을 하는 것 같습니다.
네. 그러면 이런 수익률 순서 리스크를 고려하면서 은퇴소득을 만드는 방법들이 여러 가지 있을 텐데, 그 방법들에는 어떤 것들이 있는지, 그리고 미국에는 이런 수익률 순서 위험을 해결하기 위한 상품이나 서비스들이 있는지도 한번 질문 드려보았습니다.
Yeah, that's right. This is really the options that we'll talk about with clients or individuals who are planning for retirement. Some of the more recent research I've been a part of as well with one of my colleagues, Alex Murguia, and something we talk about on the podcast, the idea of retirement income styles, that there are different ways to approach retirement, and it's important to find the approach that you're most comfortable with. So the investing approach is really based more for individuals who are comfortable relying on the idea that stocks should outperform bonds and that you can rely on that as part of your retirement. And also who just value having a lot of flexibility for their assets. But some of the other approaches, things like annuities, that fits more income protection for individuals who value having reliable lifetime income. Or there's an approach called time segmentation or bucketing, and that's where you just approach investing a bit differently rather than having a total return investing approach where you're choosing an asset allocation of this is, say, 60% stocks and 40% bonds. Instead, it's not that you're using bond funds that like traditional bond type mutual funds, but rather you're purchasing individual bonds to cover the short-term upcoming expenses. And then you can earmark your stocks more for long-term expenses. And so people do have these different options. And it's really important to find the approach each individual is most comfortable with so that you can develop a retirement strategy that works for you And that's going to make sure that you're comfortable, you can sleep at night, you're not panicked about what's happening in the financial markets. And so, yes, that's how we present the different options to individuals to help them make sure they have something that they're comfortable with. There are some products, I think it's something we'll see more and more in the future because it's still limited. The starting point is always the total returns. So having the diversified investment portfolio that people are used to using pre-retirement and applying that as well post-retirement. And then as people start thinking about retirement, I think they start looking first at, well, how might we just rearrange that total return portfolio to focus a bit more on income, maybe reducing the volatility of the portfolio, making it easier to get the income, not being exposed to the sequence of returns risk. But then that's where retirement being something different, we start to see the evolution of those different approaches too, so that the time segmentation idea of I'll have a ladder of bonds maturing each year for the next, say, 5 to 10 years as part of the retirement plan to meet those upcoming expenses. And so that's an approach that advisors in the US have used with clients. And then also strategies around taxes and the Social Security, the pension system, making good decisions around that to get reliable income in retirement. And then there's many annuities in the United States as well that work in different ways. But, well, part of some annuities in the United States are meant more for tax reasons. But when we get into the traditional, you want this for reliable lifetime income, a number of different annuity products are developing around that to provide those solutions to individuals. And then more recent developments too, there's a whole world of structured products that kind of like a principal protected product. And that's part of it, where if the market's down, you don't experience a loss. And then if the index that you're linking to, like a stock market index, if it's up, you may get a portion of those gains. And then now there's even something called like buffered assets or registered index-linked annuities, where you don't have the full downside risk of the market, but you accept some risk of loss. And in exchange, well, you're not going to get the full growth of the market either, but in exchange for accepting some risk for loss, you might get more of the potential gains of the market than you would with a principal protected product. So these are all developing as ways to help retirees manage that sequence of returns risk.
다음 질문 넘어가 보도록 하겠습니다. 이번엔 은퇴자분들의 고민에 대한 이야기인데요. 은퇴자들이 필요 이상으로 소비를 줄이는 것처럼 은퇴 설계에서 가장 흔하게 저질러지는 실수들이 무엇인지, 그리고 노후 대비 투자에 있어서 마지막으로 어떤 점을 당부하고 싶은지 한번 의견 여쭤보았습니다.
Yeah, this is a really important issue that just the math behind retirement is really complicated. You have to figure out, well, how much can I spend so that I don't run out of money before I pass away, to last as long as I live. And there's no easy answer to that because people don't know how long they're going to live. They don't know what the financial markets are going to do during their retirement. And so they get cautious or they get worried. Well, what if I'm spending too much? I don't feel like I can spend this money because I might need it in the future. And I just don't know how long that future will last. So this is a universal problem that people do tend to underspend just because of this idea that they don't know how much is sustainable. And they worry. Another issue that can also impact this too is just things like long-term care needs, that if I live a long time and I need support or help, that, especially in the US, that can become very expensive, that people might have to move into an institution for caregiving to help take care of them at an advanced stage. That can be very expensive, and that causes people to also spend less because they worry about that possibility. Now, I think that's another area where in other countries, there is more of a social structure to provide that support, maybe part of the national pension system or government provided. That can make it easier to go ahead and spend your money if you know you have this support behind you. But if you don't, that is another issue that causes people to underspend because they're worried they might need that money to not just to pay for their expenses, but to pay for that long-term care support late in life as well. As a part of answering this question, I think maybe some of the discussion sounds pessimistic, or it sounds like retirement is really complicated. But the reality is, in studies of talking to people before they retire and after they retire, all these worries about outliving your money, all these worries about, am I ready for retirement? They tend to go away in retirement. That the people find out that things are working out okay. They can potentially even, just being able to spend money isn't the same as having a great retirement. And so they get comfortable spending what they need to meet their expenses, and they find that they're enjoying retirement much more. And they're not as worried about running out of money after they're retired. They might worry about running out of money before they retire. But once they actually retire, they start feeling much better about that. And so that is a really important point about just the actual experience in retirement. A lot of times, if you're very worried, you don't have to be as worried. Things are going to work out okay. And then also in terms of mistakes people make, a really important thing is it's not all finances. That retirement, you don't just need an investment portfolio. You also need a portfolio of just experiences and relationships and passions. People can get depressed in retirement if they don't have purpose and passion, if they don't have a reason to wake up. And for a lot of people, so much of their life is centered around their career and profession that when they no longer have that, they feel lost. They feel like if they don't have the business card that says, this is your title, this is your prestige in life, now you're retired and no one's providing you the same sort of respect anymore. That can lead to a real loss that people feel. And so it becomes very important to think about all of this before retiring and to have a plan. What's going to motivate you to wake up in the morning and to get out and to still be a valuable member of society, whether it's volunteering or just pursuing hobbies, passions. You need to have purpose and passion in retirement. And so that the biggest mistake is so many people, they retire from something instead of retiring to something, which just means they retire because they hate their job and don't want to work anymore. And that's not going to necessarily lead to a great retirement. You really want to retire because there's something else you want to do with your time. You now have the financial independence that you don't need work. You can live off of your assets, but there has to be something else you want to do. And the biggest mistake is not having that something else. And related to that too, just relationships. Spouses will be spending a lot more time together after they retire, and just planning for that and thinking about, well, what things can you do together as a couple? Where might you do things separately as well? But also just navigating that transition of being ready to spend a lot more time together. And then also maybe if you had children who are now grown, not only are you spending more time together, but you're not spending that time raising children. You just need to look for ways to make sure that relationship is still strong. I think those are some of the areas where the biggest mistakes can happen. And it's not financial at all. It's these other things that are outside of the finances. When you're investing for retirement, it is important to not just have the safe, like the principal protected type assets that may just not provide a very high return. It is important to build a diversified investment portfolio that creates some risk, but that's necessary to have that opportunity for growth. And having an investment portfolio that can provide that growth is important for having a long, sustainable retirement. And so that's something that I talk about a lot in the book. It's not that you have these very low risk assets in the investment portfolio, but you do have that diversified, globally invested diversification portfolio that can provide you the growth you need for retirement.
네, 므두셀라님, 이렇게 파워 박사가 은퇴 생활과 관련된 오해나 실수에 대한 이야기 나눠주었는데,
뭐 오해 실수를 떠나가지고 적립 기간에 가장 많이 하는 실수는요.
네.
뭐가 좋을까 고민만 하다가 행동하지 않는 겁니다. 미래에 대해서 불안해하거든요. 그리고 과거에 대해서 후회합니다.
네.
그런데 현재는 아무것도 안 합니다. 그래서 만드는 거는 생각이 아니고 액션인데 액션하지
맞아요.
않는 거에
네.
대한 후회들 되게 많이 하고요.
네.
인출하는 데 있어서 이제 고민들은 뭐냐 그러면 금고가 먼저 빌까에 대한 두려움들이 되게 많아서 돈이 있는데도 못 꺼내 쓰는 분들도 나옵니다.
네.
그래서 자산관리 방법이 자린고비 방식으로 바뀌어요. 자린고비는 굴비가 없어서 못 먹는 게 아니고 없어질까봐 못
그쵸.
먹는 것
맞아요.
같아요. 그래서 은퇴 후에는 인출 설계를 하거나 자산관리 설계를 할 때는 덩어리 형태로 돈을 만들어 놓는 것보다는 흐름을 만들어 두는 게 중요한 겁니다. 그래서 이번 달에 쓰면 다음 달에 또 나온다는 보장이 있으면 이번 달 건 좀 편하게 쓸 수 있잖아요. 그래서 그렇게 캐시플로우 흐름을 만드는 식으로 하면 좋은데 아직도 상당수의 사람들은 목돈을 꼭 쥐고 있는 게 더 낫다는 생각을 하는
네.
경우들이 많아서 거기에 대한 오해나 실수 같은 것들이 좀 있는 것 같습니다.
네, 제가 인터뷰를 하면서 가장 인상적이었던 부분은 어딘가로부터 벗어나서 은퇴한다가 아니라 어딘가를 향해서 은퇴한다. 이게 전치사 하나만 from에서 to로 바꿔 주셨는데, 네, 그 표현만으로도 약간 은퇴를 이렇게 내가 역동적으로 혹은 적극적으로 본 적이 있었나? 라는 생각이 들면서, 아, 역시 이렇게 석학들과의 만남은 자극이 되는구나를 느꼈던 시간입니다. 네, 이 인터뷰가 여러분들께도 뭔가 좋은 자극이 되었으면 하는 바람입니다. 네, 오늘 이렇게 웨이드 파우 박사와의 인터뷰를 준비해 보았는데요. 노후자금 인출 준비하시는 분들께 도움이 되었으면 좋겠습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.